I have a couple of questions. One, can you expound a little bit on your comment about boosting the scores? So this idea that having fewer hosts boosts the scores, I'm wondering how that translates to real world use, particularly in a large enterprise. I mean, can you quantify the number of hosts that you would have to reduce it to in order to get better results? And where is that sweet spot?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. We can at least empirically, OptTC had, what is it? About 1,000 hosts, or nodes, which are hosts. And Lanel had, I think it's in the tens of thousands. So yeah, 17,000. The real problem is we get that boost because we can start using more advanced non-inductive ways of representing the nodes, like the softmax encoder instead of using the inner product encoder. So I'd have to check, but I think where softmax sort of starts to fail is around 10,000. But people are working on ways to make softmax work with larger and larger numbers of larger numbers of classes to classify.
Yeah, it seems like understanding that would be important, and then trying to come up with ways to slice the problem or some other approach, right, so that it does scale, because you want that performance to scale, right?
Yeah.
You don't want it to suffer. So I'm not familiar with these two data sets that you used. Are these like internal enterprise data sets, or so is it, because when I think of lateral movement, I think it's, behind my firewall, it's inside my fortress, and they're in my network and they're moving around, but it could also be on the internet, like in the case of bots, right? So what is this data exactly?
So both of these data sets they're both open source, so anyone can go grab them. I think there's links to them in the paper. The LANL data set is the Los Alamos something lab, but that's several. It's like a big computing lab of it's an actual office type situation where people are going about their business throughout the day, and then they're running controlled malware attacks on it. OptTC, or transparent computing, is it's a similar thing. That's from DARPA. It's I'm pretty sure that it's not synthetic, but it's very, very anonymized and very I think they polish it a little bit before giving it out, but I am not I can't speak to that. There's good papers about OptTC though. I just can't remember them right now. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I'm familiar somewhat with the transparent computing program.
I had one question related to the data sets. I was curious. You started out working with, I think you mentioned Facebook and email and one other one, but ultimately you wanted to work with communications network data. So I was just wondering how that, transition went, starting with the one style of data and moving to the other.
Yeah, we the small data sets were nice because, well, they're smaller, so it's easier to tune hyperparameters and that sort of thing on those data sets. Because with something like LANL, a single training epoch takes 10, 20 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's got to train for, several hours. The other ones, the benchmarking data sets we were using, that was more just a proof of concept that this would even work. And then we could start using those to see what sorts of parameters we liked the Euler to have. And usually that did scale up pretty nicely. So it started as a proof of concept, and we wanted to see if it would translate to something bigger.
Yeah, I like your experimental approach. I like starting with these other data sets that, since you are able to generalize the problem to these temporal graphs, right? So because you could do that, it made perfect sense to use these other data sets and then scale up. So speaking of scaling up, do you have plans to try to do any tests on any live networks? And of course, you're going to have a problem there because you don't have ground truth, right?
Yes.
But it would be interesting to me, at least, to see you know, after you painstakingly figure out what is, you know, true positives and what's, you know, false negatives and all that fun stuff, how the results compare.
Yeah, it would be, that's a question. The NDSS reviewers are really interested in doing it live as well. That is something that we're looking into. It might be easy to simulate, because all the data sets we're looking at have timestamps, so it wouldn't be hard to give it those timestamps as they come in, give it those logs as they come in, and see if it can parse them into a graph fast enough to be usable as a live intrusion detection system. But yes, in terms of using it in real life, there would be no ground truth, which would be tricky. But I think it would be not trivial, but it would be an attainable project to see about streaming labeled data into it in real time and seeing how it handles that.
So why not? Could you use a red team to mount the attacks? And you just touched on one of the questions I was then going to ask, which is, would it actually work in real time in trying to detect them, or would you have to collect the data and take it offline?
Yeah, the problem with real time detection is because it's doing these stat or discrete graphs, it has to wait until a full time window has passed, and then it can analyze that whole time window, which it can do fairly quickly. It only takes, like when we're building the actual data set, it takes like 10 minutes to load. What was it, like 57 days worth of data? So I assume it would not be terribly difficult to do it live, but there would be that like discrete delay. The other thing you could do is that's if you're doing the more forensic link detection. If you're doing link prediction where you're guessing at the future, it would be, that would be almost trivial to assign like anomaly scores to connections as they come in. The harder part would be building out the graph to analyze for the next time step.
Okay. We do have another question here in the room. Laura?
Hey, great.
Yeah, Samuel Giroux, MIT Lincoln Laboratory. So the question I had was thinking about the two data sets that you talked about here. And I think LANL, at least at this point, is getting pretty old, right? I think it's from maybe the early 2000s-ish timeframe.
I was wondering about that, actually.
Yeah.
Looked it up and I didn't see a date.
I think it's pretty old, maybe you know, but either
2015, I think.
Oh, is it that recent? Okay.
There's a couple different releases. We use 2015.
Aha, that might make a big difference. Anyway, I was wondering about if you would like train on one of the data sets and test on the other and vice versa. Did you look at that? Is that feasible? Do you get reasonable accuracy? Yeah.
That's something that we're working on right now, separate from this. For most of, actually for all of the stuff we did with Euler, the training is not inductive. So host 1 on network 1 would only correlate to like what's normal for host 1 on network 1. You know what I mean? So we would need an inductive way of training the models. That's like the next step. We're also looking into, in terms of the real-time stuff, inductive representations as well as continuous time. So as stuff comes in, you could inductively assign it. There's a couple really cool papers about how to do that on temporal graphs. There's a really good one called Inductive Representation Learning on Temporal Graphs that I'd like to shout out. Really like that one a lot. So we're looking into maybe seeing if that guy's work can apply to our work on lateral movement detection in networks, preferably in real time.
Yeah, that would be really cool. And then not so much a comment, but a question, or not so much a question, but a comment that I think the lack of t-tests is not just restricted to ML papers. That seems to be a general computer science trend, and I'm not quite sure why, but I agree with you. It would be good to fix that.
Yeah. People report the error.
Days long. Normal distration can't use a t-test yet, even different test and answer.
That's true.
Fair enough, but starting somewhere might be better than nowhere.
Okay, we've got another question here in the room.
Hi, can you please elaborate on the feature space that you used? So the feature does include statistical features or like application layer feature for the...
Sure. So for both of them, for both data sets of the cyber ones, we used more or less the same features. We used, so nodes were just like one hot ID vectors, which is why it's not inductive, unfortunately. But that was the only node feature we had, which is its ID number. Edges were how many times two nodes talk to each other within the time window, and then that was normalized between, I think it was between 0 and 1. I don't think it was, no, it was standardized, not normalized, so the mean is 0, standard deviation is 1. So those are the only features we're working with, really, is the graph structure. It would be entirely possible to give nodes more features if they had them. Actually, for LANL, we did give them a little more. We labeled them as a user, a computer, or a system, which the system was like important computers in the network, like the domain controller or something like that. And that's just appended onto the one hot identity vector. But those are the only input features that we used.
Okay, so for example, a connection between one host and host A and host B. So you have like 5 features only.
So the connection is just it's just if they authenticated within this time frame.
Okay.
But it's not just a Boolean. It's like how many times did they authenticate with each other in this time frame? It's a weighted graph.
Okay. Thank you.
No other questions at the moment, Laura, here in the room.
Okay. Well, I mean, I've gotten through all my questions. I had a lot, so.
Isaiah, do you want to circle back to some of your discussion points and maybe just lead the group through some of what you're thinking and see if you can elicit any feedback from others?
Sure. Well, I think we talked about t-tests and the differences between LANL and OptTC. What's maybe interesting that we didn't bring up yet is how to integrate the runtime of a model into how you're going to evaluate it. Because if two models are essentially equally accurate and Euler is faster in some respects or something like that, can you then say that this model is better? Like I think it's really interesting to try to classify different machine learning models, and not just ours, but just in general. How do you say that this one model is better than the other, or in what domains? Because you could definitely say VGRNN is the better model when you're working on small data, because very often it would have a higher like raw area under the curve or a higher average precision, not statistically significant, but higher nonetheless. So I think it's kind of interesting just to, how do you say that one model is better than the other? There's so many different things to take into account. The other interesting thing was VGRNN. It did about equally to Euler on the smaller data, but it didn't scale up very well to the larger data sets. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe that it's more complicated, so it can generalize to the bigger data sets, or I'm really not sure. I thought that was interesting, and it was surprising results for me.
I guess one of the things that occurs to me as I listen to you is how dependent this seems to be on the size and nature of the data set. And I guess ultimately you want something that can apply more generally, more broadly, without extensive training and or reliance on those characteristics of the data set.
Yeah, I do also find that interesting, and I would encourage you to continue looking at that and run some experiments on it, and try to also see so is it just the size of the data, or is it some property or properties of the data that maybe is also confounding things, and try to figure out you said word before where the sweet spots are and where it starts to not perform well, and then you can start working on improvements.
Yeah, and that's the thing with graph neural networks in particular, is they're very on smaller data sets. They're very what's the word, like impacted by different data splits. So there's a lot of talk about how you can take some nodes and put them in the validation set, and then certain models will always perform much better. And it's very affected by that. So I think the larger graphs, because what you're putting into that validation set or what you're training on is going to be less of a difference over like such a big period of time, especially with temporal graphs where you can just take time slices and make that the validation set. I think that's a good indicator of how well a model performs.
Would there be a way to automatically analyze the data and be able to plug in different models based on an analysis, a pre-analysis of the data that says, oh, this data is better for this model or it's better for that model?
Probably. That's a good question. That'd be a good research direction. I might try that.
Yeah, I guess one of the challenges. Yeah, one of the challenges there is a lot of what you're comparing is with prior work and how Euler compares. And ultimately, you need to be able to compare with ground truth, right? And whether it's actually going to do the detection that you want.
Yeah, I mean, because let's be honest. The intrusion detection problem has been around for many years. I mean, DARPA had a program on it back in the 1990s, and we still haven't solved the problem. So I think David is right. I mean, you really just it's a good start to compare it with existing approaches, but you need to move beyond that and just see, how well is it really performing. And I would be interested to know, I mean, if you do an apples to apples comparison between, its performance with this LANL and the transparent computing data compared to the Facebook data and the Enron data. I mean, is the performance very close, or did you see like better performance on, say, when you were looking at the Enron data than over the network data? Because did you speak about that? Because I didn't catch that.
Like in terms of area under the curve and average precision. Well, one thing is that for the small data sets, we're taking an equal number of true edges and an equal number of non-edges and using that as our evaluation metric. So the numbers are going to be a lot better because we don't have the data imbalance problem that we have in a real-world lateral movement detector, where most edges are going to be benign. So it's a little difficult to compare the results of this to the results of the cybersecurity data sets. But in general, the way that Euler and VGRNN perform about similarly on detection versus how on the cybersecurity data sets they performed less similarly. I guess that's one perturbation between them, but other than that, it's kind of hard to compare.
Okay.